All right, it's a double Sedra, Acharei Kedoshim this year, and the end of Acharei deals with the illicit relationships that are prohibited, forms of incest, and, adultery is also mentioned, that the Torah prohibits, and Kedoshim starts off with the mitzvah Daber kol hadas b'nei Yisrael v'amarta lehem Kedoshim Tihyu kadosh ani Hashem Elokeichem. Speak to the entire assembly of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for holy am I, Hashem your God. And Rashi, in commenting on this mitzvah of Kedoshim Tihyu, how does one fulfill the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tihyu, of being holy? So Rashi says that the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tihyu is, in a sense, separating yourself in a manner that will prevent you from having an illicit relationship that was mentioned in the previous Sedra. Now we have to understand why. So according to Rashi, the term dusha, kadosh, holiness, is identified with these relationships that the Torah abhors. A negation of these relationships that the Torah abhors. Now, I just I started off. I forgot to mention that this year is dedicated in memory of Frank Borg, Ephraim ben Moshe, whose yard site is the 5th of Iyar. And just a few words I just want to say about Frank, that he was a very close friend. He was a member of my shul. And as I mention every year, he's a person that we continue to miss. And this year is dedicated in his memory. So the Torah tells us, so what's the idea of the connection between the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tihyu, which is the beginning of Parsha Kedoshim, and the end of Parsha Acharei, which deals with the illicit relationships of adultery and incest, which are prohibited by the Torah. It's because in being careful, in preventing these relationships, one displays holiness. And the question is, why is holiness given such significance in regard to these laws, according to Rashi? And I think I heard from my father many times, and I've seen it also mentioned in the shiurim that were written over in my uncle's name, that the Ramban in the Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah, as he called it, which we call the Yad HaChazaka. Why is it called Yad HaChazaka? The Rambam Sefer, the strong hand, because Yad is Yud is 10 and Dalet is 14. And there are 14 books in the Rambam Sefer of Mishnah Torah. And the Rambam in Yad HaChazaka, one book is called Sefer Dusha, the Book of Holiness. Now, what would one have expected to be discussed in the Book of Holiness? You would have expected him to discuss the laws about the Beis Hamikdash, the laws about the Korbanos, But interestingly, the Rambam in Sefer Dusha discusses the laws of shchita, how to prepare food that it should be kosher, hilchos macholos asuros, the types of foods that are prohibited, hilchos isurei bia, relationships that are prohibited. Why did the Rambam choose in Sefer Dusha to speak about these halachas? But the Rambam wants to emphasize that Dusha doesn't necessarily manifest itself, doesn't manifest itself in withdrawal from physical life. But Kedusha manifests itself, on the contrary, in the sanctification of the mundane, in the most mundane aspects of life. And to a certain degree, I think this is part of the problem of various groups that have arisen in Judaism in the last 150, 200 years, that try to change the focus of our tradition. They have turned the central focus of religion, of tradition, to the temple or to the synagogue. And while initially they might have had some success as people were leaving the ghettos, ultimately these movements are dwindling in size, and they're not able to sustain themselves. And they really have to open up their doors to non-Jews. There will be excuses. Why? But the truth is, because they failed in what they saw as their mission. They thought by changing tradition, they will attract more and more people of Jewish descent. But long term, it had the opposite effect. The home, Jewish tradition wasn't made that you leave your Judaism in the synagogue or in the temple. But Jewish tradition dictates that wherever you go, the tradition, the ritual, the practices have to go with you. And especially in the home. More than anywhere else. The home is the center of the continuation of our heritage, even more so than the synagogue. I always mention that when the temple was destroyed, all kinds of reasons are mentioned that was the cause of our temple being destroyed, the temple in Jerusalem, the Beis HaMikdash. And very few of them, almost none of them, have anything to do with the temple itself, but it has to do with sins or omissions of mitzvahs outside the temple, or the way we interacted with people not in the temple, not in the Beis HaMikdash. Why is it? Because it could be that when they were in the temple, when they were in the Beis HaMikdash, they felt a strong relationship with God. They felt they were in the presence of God. But they didn't take that feeling, that sense of being in the presence of God with them. They left the temple. When they left the temple, in a sense, they turned the temple, they turned the Beis HaMikdash into God's prison. And the Beis HaMikdash was not made to be God's prison. And consequently, the walls of the Beis HaMikdash, that in their minds was a place where they could leave God. And they don't have to be concerned how they act outside the temple. Was destroyed. And consequently, Dusha is not something that's limited to the temple. Dusha is important wherever you go. In the Hasidus, they say that when the Torah was given, the barrier that separated heaven from earth was removed. Heaven and earth became one. And the idea behind it is the sanctification of the mundane, the sanctification of that which was given to us by God. The Gemara in Brachas talks about how if someone eats something and he doesn't make a bracha, it's kilu mo'al. It's like he derived benefit from that which was holy with that which didn't belong to him, that he was not given a license to eat. And the whole world belongs to God. But there are certain things that God gives us license for. And there are certain things that God doesn't give us license for. And we recognize those boundaries everywhere in the world. Then we are sanctifying the mundane. We are sanctifying the world. We're helping God in a sense. We're coming in aid of God in bringing heaven down to earth. And so this is what Rashi's saying. Rashi's saying is that specifically the Torah is emphasizing that in the most mundane aspects of life, holiness is not limited to ritual. Holiness is not limited to the temple. Holiness is not limited to the shul, to the Beis HaMikdash. But holiness is important everywhere. And so this is how Rashi explains Kedoshim Tihyu. And he connects it because he was troubled about the connection between the end of last week's Setra and the beginning of this week's Setra. However, the Ramban, it's one of the most famous Rambans in Chumash. He explains Kedusha from a different perspective. He says that it's possible for a person to observe the letter of the law, to be scrupulously devoted. Maybe devoted is a bad word, but scrupulous in his observance of the laws of the Torah. And nevertheless, to be considered a novel b'reshus HaTorah, a degenerate within the law of the Torah. In other words, he will observe every mitzvah, but his character is one of indulgence. It's gluttony, licentiousness. We're prohibited from eating many foods. And we're prohibited from mixing foods and eating certain foods together. But one could be very careful about that and act like a glutton in any case. And the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tihyu comes and says that in addition to the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, you have to act in a proper manner. And the Torah identifies that, according to the Ramban, as a form of Kedusha, that's a display of holiness. And as the Ramban quotes the Gemara in Yevamos, that a person has to sanctify himself in that which he's permitted. Now, I'm somewhat troubled about this explanation, and I'll explain to you why. Because whenever we see the word dusha, kadosh, it is associated, of course, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with the upper heavens, and with the Jewish people. We don't find that the word kadosh, yes, we find it in regard to Shabbos, and Shabbos was made for the Jewish people. We don't find the word kadosh or the idea of dusha in regard to the nations of the world. My father told me that during time of World War II, when President Roosevelt died, now, today, we know how unsensitive President Roosevelt was to the plight of the Jews all over the world. He didn't feel any moral responsibility to interfere with the genocide that the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, were committing against the Jewish people. But at that time, President Roosevelt was viewed as a hero. And we can understand why, and even by Jews, especially by Jews. I think they said in the Jewish sections of Chicago, President Roosevelt got like 99% of the vote, because it was Roosevelt against Hitler. And when he died, to a large degree, he was mourned by many in the Jewish communities. And not only that, the Hespedim were made all over the United States for President Roosevelt. And to a certain degree, even though we know who Roosevelt really was, but we have to take notice that he was the leader of the free world, and he was leading the war against Hitler Yamach Shemo. So Hespedim were made all over, my father told me. And he mentioned that in the Yeshiva Tveres Yerushalayim, where Moshe Feinstein Zatzal was the Rosh Yeshiva, that was one of the central institutions in the Lower East Side in those days. And the Lower East Side was perhaps the center of the Orthodox community in New York at that time. There was a hesped given at that time for Roosevelt. There were a number of people who spoke. Some were politicians. Under the circumstances of that time, it was necessary. After all, the United States was a haven for so many immigrants. It should have been a haven for more. But there were many that were able to save themselves by entering the United States one way or another. And Moshe Feinstein, my father told me, gave a very appropriate hesped. He didn't speak about anything about President Roosevelt personally. He spoke about him as the leader of the United States. And he mentioned how the Gemara tells us, in Maseches Avos, we say that one should be mispalo b'shlomo shel malchus, that we pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the peace of our government, and we have to a certain degree, show loyalty to our government. Doesn't mean that we have to be blind, but loyalty we have to show. Because if not for the government, one person would swallow up another one. When Moshe Feinstein Zatzal said, according to what I heard from my father, and especially today, when it's not just a question of one individual swallowing up another individual, but it's countries swallowing up countries. So we have to recognize the importance of the government, even though we would prefer that they would act in a manner that was more fitting. And then my father told me, there were other speakers at that time. You have to realize at that time you needed the aid of government officials, not just for the Jewish community in the United States that was presently there, but you needed their help. Not that they always were so quick to do it, to give it, even though many of them were Jews, and trying to get visas and bring other people over. It was a case of Sakonis Nefashos. There were other speakers also, politicians, but it was absolutely necessary. And then at the end, a Kel Mole Rachman was made. And that was necessary also, because everybody knew that at funerals, at spadim, at eulogies, you have a Kel Mole Rachman. And at that time, Rav Michal Feinstein Zatzal, the nephew of Rav Moshe Feinstein, later became the son-in-law of the Brisker Rav, and one of the outstanding Talmidei Chachamim, even at that time, when he was young, many considered him the greatest Lamdan in Eretz Yisrael in later years. So he went over to the person making the Kel Mole Rachamim, according to what my father told me. And he said to the person, do not say b'malos doshim utahorim. He said, we have chasidei umos olam. We have the pious among the nations of the world. But we do not have doshe umos olam. There is no holiness among the nations of the world. Person could be very fine. He could have good personality traits. He can be sensitive. But that doesn't make him kadosh. That doesn't make him holy. Holiness among men, from a halachic perspective, is reserved for the Jewish people. Because we are the Am HaNivchar. We are the chosen people. And so the question I have, so only the Jewish people. So the question is, according to the Ramban says Kedoshim Tihyu doesn't come to tell me about the mitzvahs of the Torah. It comes to tell me, which is identified with the Jewish people, but it comes to tell me about something else, about the character traits, about not being a novel b'Rishus HaTorah. Not to be degenerate. That wouldn't seem to be something that we would identify with the word dusha. Not to be degenerate. It's not something that just focuses on the Jewish people. We expect that from the non-Jews as well. So how is it that the Ramban understands Kedusha about not being a novel b'Rishus HaTorah, which emphasizes and includes things that are not mentioned in the Torah, but have to do, for the most part, have to do with general human character, a proper way of acting. Almost a lot of it would seem to be like a form of etiquette. So why is that identified? Why is that identified with Dusha? I think the reason is, I think this is what the Ramban is trying to tell us. That one could do all the mitzvahs of the Torah. And not let the mitzvahs of the Torah affect his personality. The mitzvahs of the Torah were not just given to, which they are, it's an act of submission to the command of God. But God wants those mitzvahs to affect our personality as well. And when we are told by the Torah, there are limitations what we can eat, and there are things that we can't eat. Of course, the most important thing is to submit to that command. But it goes beyond that. And it teaches us the idea of limitations in regard to eating. And in many areas of life. And it applies to things that are outside the realm of strict halacha. But in applying to those areas that might seem to be outside strict halacha, it makes them part of strict halacha, but in a different sort of way. Now, there is, at least the way I see it, there seems to be two approaches in understanding the effect of the relationship between the mitzvos of the Torah and the midos of a person and the character traits of a person. If you take a look at the chinuch, and in certain places the Ramban, and perhaps in certain places the Rambam also, part of the mitzvah, part of the purpose of the mitzvahs of the Torah is to affect the personality of the person. There is a discussion, there are all kinds of contradictions regarding the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKan, sending away the mother bird, whether it's to make us sensitive, to give us feelings of rachmanus, mercy. In regard to many of these mitzvos, also that's Benolo Sishatu B'Yom Echad. So in other words, from Rishonim, it appears they see that the mitzvos, in addition to the act of submission to the actual command, we have to let it affect our personality. However, I think the Balei Musar had a different perspective. And this might have its origin in some of the writings of the Gra, that, on the contrary, you have to work on your midos, on your personality traits, on your tendencies, in order to fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah. In other words, if you're not going to work independently on your personality traits, the Evan Shleim of the Gra, my impression is years ago I saw that. You have to work on your personality traits in order to be able to fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah. And it would seem that according to what I'm suggesting, the Ramban is better understood in accordance with the shitos of the Rishonim. In other words, the mitzvahs of the Torah, the mitzvahs are identified with Kedusha. The whole Torah is identified with Kedusha. So the mitzvahs of the Torah have to affect our personality. Now, the idea that midos, personality traits, are identified with being Jewish. Now, it's not that a non-Jew can't have good personality traits. He can have good personality traits. I know there are those that seem to limit that, but person could have very good personality traits, could have sensitivities. But nevertheless, I think it's of a different form. We take a look at Parshas Vayera. The Parshas Vayera, that's just after Avram Avinu does his bris milah, which to a certain degree represents him reaching the stage of being completely Jewish. Up till he has his circumcision, he's in the process of severing himself from his former connections. But when he gets the mitzvah bris milah, it's his halech lefanai v'heyeh samim. That's when he becomes fully identified as a Jew, the first Jew, the father of the Jewish people. There was a disagreement whether it was a form of gerus or he became Jewish without conversion. But everybody admits that his Jewishness is achieved at that point. So, and what do we see after that? Abraham is outside the sitting outside his tent, and he is visited by three malachim, three angels, and he doesn't recognize them, at least initially, as being angels. He thinks they are three nomads traversing the desert, and he runs and he serves them food and he makes sure they're able to rest and he washes their feet. What do we see? Gemilas Chesed. And then we see Abraham pleading, and he did, in his eyes, they certainly weren't Jewish, and he didn't know that they were angels. And then we see that he pleads on behalf of the people of Sdom, certainly not Jews, Rishayim. But he pleads on their behalf. We see mercy, Rachmanim. And regarding Sarah, the Torah tells us, V'hinei ba'ohel, she's in the tent. Baishan, modesty. And those are the three personality traits of a Jew. Now, there are those that would suggest, I don't even want to say what they would suggest. It's not that they didn't have, it's not that they didn't have these traits beforehand, but the Torah emphasized it here when they became Jewish. Why does the Torah emphasize it here? The Torah emphasizes it here because the Torah wants to identify personality traits with being Jewish. And in Parsha Shemos, when Basia, the daughter of Paro, goes lirchotz alayor, according to Rashi in the Medrash and the Gemara and Megillah, she went to go through Geirus to convert. And the Torah isn't so much interested in telling us that she converted, as the Torah is interested in telling us that after her conversion, she saved the life of Moshe. In spite of the fact that she was the daughter of Paro. Her sensitivity, Miyaldei Ha'ivrim, is a Jewish child. Torah wants to point out that this is part of the definition. This is her initiation into Judaism. And who can bring a bigger symbol of Gerus, of conversion to Judaism than Rus? And the chesed that Rus did for Naomi, that's identified with the conversion of Rus as well. Now, I personally think that all of them had these traits beforehand, but it's emphasized by the Torah and by the Navi in conjunction with their becoming Jewish. Because somehow these traits have special meaning, not just because these traits are desirable traits, but it has special meaning in being Jewish. And I was told, now, so clearly, whether you follow the shita of the chinuch, that the mitzvos causes the traits, or you want to say the traits is necessary for the fulfillment of the mitzvah. And I was told by somebody, I haven't seen it inside, that the Chazon Ish would say that when you do gerus, you have to check out to see if the potential ger, not only whether he'll be committed to the halacha, but you have to see his personality traits, his midos. Does he have the proper midos as well? It's interesting, the Lashon, the Ramban's both kinoso. We search him out. Now, what's the idea behind it? And also, I just want to add, even the Gra Shita, the Gra's opinion was that you have to have Tikkun Hamidos. In Evan Shlema, you have to fix the personality traits. You have to fix the personality traits of a person in order that he should fulfill. A person has to fix his own personality traits in order that he should fulfill the mitzvos. But there seems to be a sort of a contradiction, because you have some svarim that were likutim of the Gra on different mesechtas. And I saw one of the likutim of the Gra on Masechah Shabbos, and the Gra says there, Habor Reik Ein Bo Mayim, the pit that Yosef was thrown into didn't have water. So Chazal say, our sages tell us, Ein Bo Mayim, didn't have water. Aval Nechoshim V'Akrabim Yesh Bo. but it had snake and scorpions. And the Gra, through God, on the basis of Kabbalah, says that Ein bo mayim shel Torah. If there is no water of Torah, Torah is identified with water. So they had, because they didn't learn Torah for 3 days. The Gemara in Bava Kama tells us. And before Amalek came also, they didn't have water. And they rebelled against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And they said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu u'mayin. Is God in our midst or not? So the Gra says, if you don't have Mayim Shel Torah, you have Nechashim v'Akrabim. You have snakes and scorpions of bad traits. From here it seems, on the contrary, that what prevents the bad traits, according to the Gra, is the Torah. Torah doesn't just mean learning Torah. Torah means observance of Torah also. But even according to the Gra, we could suggest that you need to work, a person has to work on his traits to perform mitzvos, to fulfill the mitzvos. But to perpetuate, but the midos, even after you do mitzvos, if a person acquired good traits, but if he doesn't follow through with commitment to Torah, to learning Torah where he could, and the performance of mitzvos, so then the Nechashim v'Akrabim, all the good traits that he worked on crumble. For the good traits to remain, you need Torah to sustain them. It's possible. I don't know. I was thinking, where did the Gra see it? My father used to say the same thought. He didn't mention it in the name of the Gra. He would just say, nature abhors a vacuum. And if you don't have Mayim Shel Torah, you'll have Nechashim v'Akrabim. He didn't say of mitos, Nechashim v'Akrabim. But I saw the name of the Gra that had reference to mitos. So if you don't have Mayim, so the idea is to sustain the good mitos. Even if you have good mitos, without Torah, there's no assurance that those good midos will remain. My uncle mentioned that when he was a student in the University of Berlin, so he had the outstanding philosophy professors of the time as his teachers. And their specialty was ethics. And overnight, when the Nazi party took control of Germany, these specialists of ethics, some of the world's greatest philosophers of the time, they became the leading philosophers of the Nazi party. They acted in an ethical manner beforehand. But ethics by itself, without Torah, is not kitcha, is no guarantee of permanence. Only with Torah and sincere Torah is there some guarantee of ethics. And it's very interesting of not being a novel B'Rishus HaTorah. And it's interesting when you take a look at so in other words, even the ethics, which or personality traits, acting in a proper manner, that is identified with Torah. Whether it's Torah that causes the ethics or the ethics that gives us the ability to observe the Torah, the two have to go hand in hand. And if they don't go hand in hand, then the personality traits, and sometimes the personality traits could crumble and be used just for the very opposite purposes. And very often, the same thing is true in the reverse. If a person will just learn, but will not have the proper personality traits, will not act in a proper manner, then the Torah itself would crumble. The two have to go hand in hand. And so that's the idea of Dusha. It's interesting. We talk about the Beis Hamikdash of being kitshel of shaita v'kitshel lasad lavo. The Beis Hamikdash is holy forever, according to the Ramban. And the Ram says why? Because it has Dusha Shechina. The Dusha Shechina comes when the Torah is coupled together with the ethics. Each person is a mikdash in himself. So the ethics can remain permanently if it's coupled with Torah. But if it's not coupled with Torah, you could be the philosopher, the ultimate ethical philosopher. And in one moment, it all crumbles. So this is the idea of Kedoshim Tihyu. Yes, it has to do with the personality traits as well. And it's interesting. Dusha, as I mentioned, represents something that's uniquely Jewish. And when you take a look at the Sedra, the first mitzvah mentioned after the requirement to be holy, Kedoshim Tihyu, which is a uniquely Jewish trait, which is based on identification with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ma'ani kadosh afata yeh kadosh, as it's mentioned in certain places. So, ma'ani kadosh afata yeh kadosh. So, the mentions ishimo vaviv tiro, respect or fear, reverence for your parents. Now, reverence for parents, that's something that's not uniquely Jewish. I would have thought that after Dusha, after talking about Dusha, which is a uniquely Jewish thing, it would have a mitzvah that is identified. Okay, Shabbos is mentioned after that. But why is Kibbur Avayim mentioned immediately afterwards? When my uncle Zatzal was sitting Shiva for his wife, for my aunt, That time, I was there for the funeral. I was there for the first day. I was there for the beginning of the Shiva. But after I left with my parents back to Chicago, I was told that Rav Hutner came to be Menachem Avel, my uncle. They had known each other years before. Rav Hutner would be very often by my grandfather's house in Warsaw. In fact, Rav Hutner, when my father was 12 years old and my grandfather went to New York for 1 year, my father learned, Rav Hutner taught my father for 1 year. My father considered him as a Rabbi of his for the rest of his life. Rav Hutner came to Menachem Avel, my uncle. And the discussion that took place, Rav Teitz was there at that time also, I'm told. And the discussion that took place was, why is it that for a parent, there is a veilus for a year. And when it comes for a wife, who to a certain degree a person is closest to, Alkein Yazov Ish, Ezava V'imo V'davak V'ishto. Avelus is only for 30 days. And my uncle, and when the question was mentioned to my father gave the same answer. He said that a person is less likely to forget his wife, but a person is more likely to forget. Consequently, in order to remember the parent, the Chachamim instituted 12 months of Avelus. However, Rav Hutner at that time suggested the reason is because the parent is the linkage that the person has to Matan Torah, to the giving of Torah, to Har Sinai, to Maimed Har Sinai. And because of that, the Avelus is a year long. And Rav Teitz said, because of Kibbur Av V'Ein. I'm just wondering whether we can't take these two answers and put them together. Yes, we learn out aspects of Kibbur Av V'Ein from the way perhaps non-Jews acted. The Gemara in Dushin mentions all kinds of cases that they wouldn't wake up their father, no matter how much money they would make. But Kibbur Av V'Ein for the Jew means something much more. Kibbur Av V'Ein is not just Hakaras Hatov, recognition of what the parents did for us, but Kibbur Av V'Ein also is Kibbur Av V'Ein is the connection, the linkage to Matan Torah. And we could even suggest it's the linkage to the Avos also. It's the linkage to our whole heritage. And ultimately to the special relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that took place at Matan Torah. And it could be that that's what the Torah is emphasizing here. Kedoshim Tihyu. How are you going to be holy? By recognizing your linkage to Matan Torah, by recognizing your connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Maseches Avos, it's called Maseches Avos. which talks about the proper way to act. It says, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. Why here? Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. Why in this Masechta? And all the Mepharshim say, because Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, you think it applies to halachas, applies to kashrus, it applies to laws of the Beis Hamikdash, it applies to ritual. It also applies to the way you act, to your demeanor, to your personality traits. That's also part of Torah. You can't view that as something separate. That's the idea of Kedoshim Tihyu. That's part of making your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu a permanent relationship. And it's part of recognizing that you're God, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're always in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. My father once asked, actually every year Yom Kippur, he would ask, Parshas Kedoshim talks about being holy. That's the highest rung on the ladder of perfection. And the end of Parshas Acharei talks about incest. That's the depth of immorality. It seems like the whole Torah could have separated the two. Seems the whole Torah could have separated the two. How are we to understand it? My father said, the only assurance that we have that we will not fall into the abyss of immorality is if we dedicate ourselves to the highest form of character. As I once heard from a speaker, there's no such thing as an average American. An average American has 1.95 legs. We don't try to be average. We don't try to be better than anybody else. We try to be as good as we can. We have to constantly improve ourselves. And that's the highest rung. In Parshas Shmini, it says, in making yourself kadosh, you are kadosh. But you have to constantly move up and up the ladder. At the end of Parshas Bereshis, the Torah says, "Vayelech Hanochim Elokim, ve'enenu ki lokachos Elokim." Hanoch walked with God, and he wasn't there anymore because God took him out of this world. And Rashi says, "Tzaddik he was a tzaddik." But for Kal Beinov Loshuv, it came easy for him to turn his ways. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu quickly took him out of the world. What's the idea? And why was Kal Beinov Loshuv? Chanoch walked with God. My father once said, the problem with Chanoch is that he thought he reached the apex. There was no higher level for him to go. We always have to work to improve ourselves. We never reach the apex. We always have to ask, what can I do better to improve myself? How can I let the mitzvos, even if I'm observing the same mitzvos, how can I let those mitzvos improve my character even more? We can't make the mistake of Chanoch. Chanoch walked with God. He thought that he reached the highest level possible. And the Chazal already point out the difference in Lashonos. I'm going to suggest something a little different. An additional pshat. He says, by Avram, it says, by the bris milah of Avram, when Avram became a Jew, his halech lefanai, the hey samim. The mandate of bris milah, the mandate of being a Jew, is walk before me. There's space between me and you. But Es Elokim is Halech Noach. Noach, there was no space. He walked with God. He needed God's help. That's the way Chazal explained it. I just want to suggest, in the contrary, the two pshatim work together hand in hand. In being a Jew, God was telling Abraham the mandate is, do not think you reach the apex. You constantly have to improve yourself. The whole idea of bris milah is that we have to make an improvement. We have to make a change. We have to be a partner of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in perfecting the world and in perfecting ourselves. That's the whole idea of bris milah. So, vayelech, so his halech lefanai v'hei samim. And then you'll be able to walk yourself. But if you think that you're going to you reach the apex, you're going to fall. You're going to have to need God's help to stay. In other words, the mandate of being a Jew is to constantly let the mitzvos HaTorah affect our personalities. Let the mitzvos HaTorah affect our personalities. And when we let the mitzvos HaTorah affect our personalities, we'll constantly try to improve ourselves. Yes, you have to do all the mitzvos HaTorah. You have to do all the mitzvos HaTorah at any time. But the way it affects our personalities, that can change from time to time. So that is the definition. That is the mandate of the Jew, to constantly his halech lefanai. There's ways to improve yourself, even if you observed all the mitzvahs HaTorah. But the way the mitzvahs HaTorah affect you, that is something that can change and can improve from time to time. And this is the idea of Kedoshim Tihyu, of being holy. But our holiness manifests itself in letting the mitzvos HaTorah affect our personalities. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. If someone comes to a conclusion that's against what Chazal say, does that show that they're not letting the mitzvahs affect their personality?
What do you mean?
Like the story of a woman who asked your uncle that she wanted to feel spiritual and wear a tallis. So he told her to wear a tallis without tzitzis and come back to him in a month. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, a person has to, the spirituality has to come from, and I think that was the lesson that my uncle was trying to teach her. The spirituality has to come from the mitzvahs. I wasn't talking so much about the spirituality as the character traits, but the spirituality has to come from the mitzvahs. Otherwise, there are so many religions that offer them the feeling of spirituality as well. That's what makes these all these other religions very popular, because there's looking for spirituality without mitzvahs. Without the halacha, I should say, in that case.
Is Tuma the opposite of Kedusha?
Tuma, I wouldn't say it's exactly the opposite of Kedusha. In certain areas they are, but Tuma is a negation. It contaminates it contaminates Kedusha.
I think in New York, many decades ago, your father gave a share saying that Kedusha is permanence.
Okay, that's
And so
similar.
to that it could be opposite of Tuma, because if Tuma comes from
Temporary.
end of life.
And I said in certain areas, yes, but in certain areas, I wouldn't call it the opposite. That's, Kedusha is dedication, separation. I don't know that Tuma, Tuma could also be viewed to a certain degree as separation. It depends from what perspective you're looking at it.
I mean, someone could be tahor, the opposite of tuma, that doesn't make them kadosh.
Tar is the opposite of tuma. Dusha is something different, but tar is usually a prerequisite or a requirement in regard to dusha.
So thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.